Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. This is Jason, host of Fighting Words Financial, and today I want to have a discussion with you about the petroleum industry and how changes in production have radically transformed Western economies in the last 15 years, even if it isn't so obvious to people not in the oil industry, and how those changes in production have reshaped geopolitics and the global economy. And I promise you that all of these threads will weave together, and at the close of the video we'll talk about 4 factors that may affect oil prices this year and why I will likely not be adding more oil to my personal investment portfolio, but I am likely to add liquid natural gas producers. Energy companies were really the sole bright spot for many investors last year, but this year the serious factors that may affect oil prices, without including a black swan event like the outbreak of World War III, those factors are likely to offset each other to some degree. And I think that we may see some measure of price stability throughout 2023, with oil rising slightly through the end of the year, but with oil companies seeing their amazing profits moderate due to labor and capital constraints. So as we near the 1-year anniversary of the disastrous Russian invasion of Ukraine, you can't miss the fact that Russia's energy policy has been a miserable failure and did not provide Russia the economic leverage to win the war quickly and decisively. 4 groups of people are really responsible for this. First, it's the Ukrainians themselves. Their bravery and willingness to fight for their homeland alone is the largest factor that has denied Vladimir Putin the ability to break a global order that has mostly prevented large-scale European conflict since World War II. Second is people in the European Union for not caving to energy blackmail and being steadfast in their resolve to see Ukraine survive as a nation. Third, it's Russian leadership for failing to see that changes in oil markets deprive them of their primary weapon to ensure Ukrainian isolation. And finally, number 4, it's shale oil and gas workers in West Texas, North Dakota, and Pennsylvania. No, seriously, fracking is probably one of the largest contributors to the conflict, as well as one of the largest reasons that Europe has not caved to Russian aggression. It has both created a now or never moment for Putin, and it's also robbed him of the ability to meaningfully wage economic warfare on the West. In fact, fracking and the shale revolution has really been doing this since about 2013. It has nothing to do with some unfair US policy or some nefarious conspiracy to rob Russia of what they think is their rightful place on the world stage. Nope, it was just good old-fashioned American ingenuity, risk-taking, and hard work. Hydraulic fracturing or fracking led to massive new exploitation of previously unavailable oil and natural gas deposits locked up in shale formations. It was quite simply a technological revolution. The Russian energy industry failed to innovate in response, failed to invest, and ultimately failed to compete in global markets. I cannot help but to think how very different global wealth distribution and the politics of power would be if it weren't for the shale revolution that began with a whisper in 2005, but by 2018 was a roar that Russia could no longer ignore. US and Canadian shale oil and gas production has ripped the heart out of the economic ambitions of Russia mostly, but also of Iran and Venezuela to a lesser degree. It has done that mostly by increasing petroleum production in the United States and Canada, most of which is domestically consumed, and by lowering global oil prices over the last 15 years. Fracking gradually but drastically reduced a 60-year transfer of wealth from countries that were dependent on oil imports to countries that were net petroleum exporters. By 2018, if you added liquid natural gas to this equation, the massive wealth transfer was, at least in the United States, set to reverse. You see, as late as the year 2000, liquid natural gas only accounted for roughly 26% of natural gas trade. By 2020, that share had risen to 45% of the global market. But given the geographic limitations of gas pipelines, natural gas markets weren't really global. Natural gas markets are fractured into 3 segmented regional markets: the North American market, the Asia Pacific market, and the European market. Each market is dominated by specific suppliers at differentiated price points. But since the 2013 timeframe, the increase in liquid natural gas tankers and abundant cheap liquid natural gas from North American shale made it possible to bypass the constraints imposed by regional pipeline networks and began to threaten the dominance of Russia when it came to supplying the European market. Even though the cost of liquid natural gas initially hindered its development, almost every European nation with a coastline has invested in a liquid natural gas terminal in the last decade. The United States and Canada, relying on shale gas production, emerged by 2020 as the world's leading liquid natural gas exporters, thus upsetting regional market balance patterns and beginning to globalize markets. Well, the European market. The European market was beginning to globalize, which would reduce the leverage that a regionally dominant supplier like Russia could wield to get what they want. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the weaponization of gas supplies has pushed EU member states to fast-track new liquid natural gas infrastructure. In total, there are 29 operational liquid natural gas terminals in Europe today, and now there are more than 33 planned investments already under construction or in planning stage. The global liquid natural gas tanker fleet is also set to double in the next 2 years as a result of Russian overreach and the expansion of liquid natural gas infrastructure. So Putin has definitely created a new world order. It just wasn't the one he expected or wanted, and it's going to further reduce the power and influence of the Russian Empire. Which brings me to the thought that has kept me up at night for the last couple of weeks, wondering what if? What if there had never been a shale revolution? How would global politics have shifted over the last 15 years? How would the difference in the global distribution of wealth may have played out for something like the invasion of Ukraine? Many of you watching this video have probably never considered this. Just how much of the current U.S. oil and natural gas production is a result of the shale revolution? It's probably a lot more than you think. Back in 2005, total U.S. oil production was roughly 5.1 million barrels per day, and our oil consumption was about 20.7 million barrels per day, which leads us to buy a lot of imported oil. Today, the U.S. produces about 12.3 million barrels a day of domestically produced oil and consumes around 18.7 million barrels a day. Despite what you may have heard in the media, the U.S. has not since the early days of internal combustion engines ever actually produced enough oil to meet all of our demands, and current oil production is pretty close to that record high of 12.86 million barrels per day, which was set in early 2019. So between 2005 and 2023, the United States has added about 7.3 million barrels a day to global production. Today, global production of oil is roughly 89.9 million barrels a day, so that 7.3 million barrel a day addition represents about 8.1% of global production. So if the shale revolution was so impactful, like I say it is, how much of that 7.3 million barrel per day increase came from shale? All of it. Really, all of it. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that in 2021, 7.23 million barrels a day came from tight oil resources, meaning low permeable shale, sandstone, carbonate rock formations, all made possible by hydraulic fracturing or fracking. The story for natural gas is remarkably similar, from 50 billion cubic feet per day in 2005 to roughly 100 billion cubic feet today in 2023. In that time period, shale gas went from being roughly 5% of total production to 70% of total production. Shale gas accounts for all of the increase since 2005. So what is the economic value of this increased oil and gas production as a result of the shale revolution made possible by hydraulic fracturing? It's not simply the $212 billion a year in oil, gas, and petroleum derivative sales. The impact of the shale revolution goes far beyond just those companies that are directly linked to the petroleum industry. Lower energy and lower capital costs during the investment phase of the shale revolution have made a lot of ancillary economic growth possible. In 2017, it was estimated that just in the first 10 years of the shale revolution, meaning through 2015, fracking created a staggering estimated $3.5 trillion in new wealth. Later on, a study done by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas estimated in 2019 that over the preceding decade, the shale boom accounted for 10% of US GDP growth. Just in simple dollar terms, that $3.5 trillion in new wealth created just in the first 10 years of the shale revolution is just about double the current GDP of Russia at $1.78 trillion. Now, it's been 4 years since that study was done, and US energies haven't quit making profits. The total benefit that the shale revolution imparted on the United States and Canada is probably incalculable at this point and likely greater than that 10% estimated by the Federal Reserve back in 2019. So I have to wonder, what would the world look like today if there had been no shale revolution? There is no way of knowing where oil prices would be if you took the 8.1% of global production that shale is responsible for out of global markets. And there's also not really a way of knowing how much growth inside the United States and Canada economically would never have happened without the shale revolution. And you also have to question what the shape of geopolitical power would be today if that great transfer of wealth from the United States to Russia in the form of petro sales had continued along the trajectory which looked pretty set way back in 2005. I remember having discussions with oil industry experts back in that time period about what our likely response would be if any major oil exporters simply refused to sell oil to the United States again, like what happened during the oil embargo of 1973. The most common response I heard was to pray. The situation really looked that precarious at the time. The situation with U.S. shale oil production did not go unnoticed by Russia. In fact, Russia made a concerted effort to drive U.S. and Canadian shale oil producers out of business, even before Putin probably realized that shale gas producers are just as big a threat in 2023. Back in 2020, Putin pulled a move that most people have forgotten, for good reason. The timing was horrible for Putin and likely in some way led to his decision to create a wider conflict in Ukraine. In early March of 2020, Putin spurned an effort by OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, of course, to cut oil production and raise global prices. Putin's publicly stated goal at this time period was to drive American shale oil producers out of business and to reclaim market share. He figured that if he could drive the price of oil below $50 a barrel for a long enough time, the debt-fueled growth of U.S. shale producers would evaporate and these companies would fall into bankruptcy. Less than 2 weeks after this declaration of war on U.S. shale oil producers, oil was already down by 31%. Then the unimaginable happened. By March 16, 2020, most Western economies were shutting down in an effort to slow the spread of COVID. Oil demand dried up far beyond the plans that Putin had to ruin the U.S. shale oil industry. Oil prices and demand dropped so quickly that oil futures contracts actually dipped briefly into negative dollar territory several times in the spring of 2020. This prompted a massive round of corporate subsidies in the United States. Most shale producers were able to avoid bankruptcy and resume operations once demand returned to normal levels. This likely ruined a multi-year plan of wealth extraction by the Russian dictator. So by 2022, all of his plans are in ruins. US GDP has more than doubled since 2005, and the shale revolution may have contributed upwards of 10% of that growth. Russia's share of global oil production is shrinking in this time period, along with revenues, and abundant US natural gas supplies and European investment in liquid natural gas terminals is now threatening not just the vast wealth flowing to the oligarchs, or let's just call them boyars of the Russian Empire, but also the leverage they hold over their neighbors. The shale revolution is both a major contributing cause of the Ukraine conflict and the reason that the Russian Empire hasn't had the leverage to steamroll Europe into submission. It isn't just about the political and economic leverage that is missing. I think that the shale revolution is one of the major reasons the Russian military has also fallen into such disrepair. Since shale oil production really started reaching a fever pitch in 2013 and moderated oil prices, the military budget of the Russian Empire has decreased by roughly 25%, declining from $88 billion annually to roughly $65 billion by 2021. While these numbers are tiny compared to the US military budget, imagine what the Russian military would look like today if that $3.5 trillion in new wealth created in the first 10 years of the shale revolution had instead been transferred to Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in the form of petroleum sales. And if the shale revolution really accounts for 10% of our $13 trillion increase in GDP since 2005, like the Dallas Fed says, the difference that shale has made to our GDP is worth almost as much as the entire gross domestic product of Russia. What would Russia and Iran in particular have done with an extra 1.3 trillion in GDP annually? And how much of that would have been invested in projecting power onto their neighbors? What would Russia have invested in their military? Would Ukraine have even lasted longer than a week? And would Europe just have caved to economic blackmail? Can you imagine what geopolitics would look like in a world where Russia and Iran were emboldened by an additional 1.3 trillion in gross domestic product? All of these are questions that I consider late at night when I think about all of the what ifs while the rest of the world is sleeping. So how do I plan to play the shale revolution in the future, and how is it going to shape the future economy? For me personally, it isn't going to be so much about oil production. I believe it's mostly going to be about liquefied natural gas. In terms of attempted economic blackmail, the European Union knows darn well that it just got lucky. It was poor timing. Putin either started too early before the EU became completely dependent on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, or he started too late, long after the Americans started looking for a way to get rid of all of the ludicrous amounts of natural gas they produced, and Europe started to get nervous about Russian dominance of the European gas market and began to build liquid natural gas terminals on every coastline. Either way, the timing did not work out for Russia, and the end result is going to be a huge global fleet of liquid natural gas carriers sailing from the US, Canada, Morocco, Algeria, Cyprus, Israel, Australia, and United Arab Emirates, all looking to serve a newly globalized European market. I also think that China will start to break down and further globalize their regional market in an effort to break their dependence on Russian and Russian-dominated Central Asian natural gas supporters. This process is actually pretty far along already, with more than half of China's gas imports coming from Malaysia, Qatar, the United States, and Australia. This all benefits U.S. shale gas producers and exporters. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, between 2022 and 2026, U.S. liquid natural gas export capacity will grow roughly 75% from 13 billion cubic feet per day to just shy of 20 billion cubic feet per day as 3 new liquefaction and export facilities come online in Plaquemine, Louisiana, Corpus Christi, and Golden Pass, Texas. U.S. oil production projections tell a different story though. Increases in oil production are expected to be incremental for the next few decades and far less dramatic than liquid natural gas. Part of this is due to the focus among shale oil companies to return shareholder equity in the form of higher dividends and share buybacks, which limits the amounts that can be invested in new capacity. The second reason is the increased cost of capital. Interest rates are higher now, and borrowing money to fuel expansion is going to be a lot more expensive than it has been in the past. Even more so if the company is already carrying a heavy debt load. A third concern is that global oil demand is only seeing incremental increases, and oil companies fear overinvestment in new production with the likelihood of an economic slowdown. A fourth concern is the fallout from price caps and oil embargoes on Russian oil. Half of all of the seaborne Russian oil exports have already been taken offline since the Ukraine invasion. As of January 1st, the Germans and the Polish have decided to stop taking deliveries of oil from the Druzhba pipeline, and as a result, Russia has announced a 500,000 barrel per day cut in production, and it has had almost zero effect on markets. The market is already priced in, losing about 60% of Russian oil production on a global basis. Okay, so having said all of that, I'm going to be focusing my investment dollars on liquid natural gas producers. The biggest reason is how the formerly regional markets of Europe and Asia are seeking to globalize and diversify natural gas suppliers. This is almost entirely due to the attempted economic blackmail on the part of Russia. This is a realignment of the old order of separate regional markets with their own supply-demand dynamics. This creates tremendous opportunity for the U.S. to step in as a supplier. The U.S. is poised to take a large portion of that new market, and we have a lot of room for capacity expansion. Because of low natural gas prices in the North American market, there has been underinvestment in U.S. natural gas production for more than a decade. Higher natural gas prices in the European market and a newfound desire of countries to end their dependence on single supplier natural gas pipelines has created a demand for member states to invest in alternative sources of natural gas. The last reason, and possibly the most important one, is that this desire in Europe at least to globalize their market and end their dependence on a single source supplier for natural gas is likely to be a permanent one. I highly doubt that Europe will ever again allow itself to be so dependent on a single supplier for their energy needs. Russia is never going to regain market dominance or the economic leverage that they enjoyed for the last 10 years. They've essentially lost their seat at the table of developed economies. Even if Russia were to call it quits today in Ukraine and send every soldier home, it will be more than a generation before trust and economic ties are restored. This all equates to massive opportunity for liquid natural gas producers in the United States. Europe is going to be buying U.S. liquid natural gas for a very, very long time. Anyway, folks, just my opinion. Of course, this is not a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any securities. Thank you very much for watching the video, and if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe. Thank you, and have a nice day.